Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 19th of October 2023. Check out what the lines on my map mean by pausing the video and looking at the key. Otherwise, let's go to the northeast sector of the front line, Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. There's no changes to the front line. There has been activity up and down the front line, places like Makivka. Apparently, Russians claim that they've made some advances there. Torska, further down to the south, and Serebryansky Forest. All the usual candidates for activity, and still the claims that the Russians are building forces in the area. But we're going to move down to Bakhmut, where there has been continued activity south of Bakhmut. Not too much to mention in these northern areas, but certainly north of Klishchivka here, some activity according to Andrew Perpetua, some gains across the railway. In fact, the gains I have here for his blue line, that I missed them. That's from a few days ago. So the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back. Their defensive line is now north of the railway line there. That is in line with the Syriac maps to some degree, a little bit more over to the west. But as we come down and around the bend here, the Russians have been pushed back to the eastern side of the railway. So some success for the Ukrainians in pushing the Russians back. Continued success in the Bakhmut area. The Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, talks about how there is partial success for the Ukrainians in the area. So yeah, just continuing there in the same vein it has been for some time, but not too many sources reporting on anything there, to be honest. There's more talk about what is going on in Avdiivka yet again, where there is continued attacking maneuvers from the Russians to the north. We've had some success to the south in the Spartak area, and also to the southwest, where as we've seen over the last few days, they've made some gains in a few of these areas. I was listening to Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night. He said that he had them only really gaining in this area, this basically dark brown field there, where they absolutely hammered it with artillery, and that enabled them to make gains. And he's found it interesting that they haven't really used much artillery elsewhere where you would expect them to. And also they claimed on the opening days of the attacks in Avdiivka, going back a week or so ago now, that they were using 200 guns and letting them rip in the area. But he's significantly found not a lot of shelling evidence, even though that is certainly evident elsewhere in places like Novomykhailivka to the south. So you would have expected there to be much more shelling. There wasn't. What they are doing is throwing an awful lot of mechanized equipment at the problem and troops, and losing them by the bucket load by all accounts. Syriac Maps says of the area situation south of Avdiivka, video footage finally appeared in this axis showing the Russian army advances along the M30 road, which led to the capture of Almaz 1 fortifications. The Russian offensive line in Avdiivka continues. Despite the losses on the first days, the troops have managed to establish themselves in the first fortifications and begin to focus on the adjacent forest towards Tsarska Ochota Resort, a key position from where they can monitor the supply lines between the city and the industrial sector, possibly the most fortified area. From the last movements, it is very possible that the southern fronts are going to have much more protagonism in this offensive, from where it will be intended to enter in urban combats on the one hand, and to take the localities of the west to create the encirclement of the city on the other hand. I'm not quite sure what to make of what the claims are there, but this is the Spartak area where the Ukrainians have been pushed back behind the road, one of these main roads, and some fortifications have been taken, apparently, according to Syriac Maps there. But actually, Andrew Perpetua has a similar story for this area, where the Russians are, as you can see, some gains according to Syriac Maps, but also naturally that should be, yeah, sorry, that is the wrong color. That should be a lighter pink. That's Andrew Perpetua's signified gains for the Russians there. They've pushed the Ukrainians back in that area. and the Russian front line is now much further to the north here. Now, there will be obviously grey zone and then Ukrainian positions further back, but actually I would suggest that there will be a lot of Ukrainian positions very close here. This is a forested area that Surya Maps was talking about, and there are, by all accounts, lots of concrete fortifications. This will be really difficult for the Russians to take. The Ukrainians have been dug in here for a long time, and actually the Russians have had very little success in getting further past here really at all over the years. So yeah, that's obviously not great news for the Ukrainians, but and also there is the possibility that they could counterattack. There might not be huge, robust forces in this area, not 100% sure, but it will be difficult for the Russians going forward in that particular area. Go on to the next source. So War Monitor says, Ukrainian forces repelled another large assault by Russian forces from a northern direction towards Avdiivka and destroyed again significant amounts of equipment and assault groups. So this is something that is coming out today, and there are quite a few people talking about this. So take Getty, for example, in the Avdiivka direction, the armed forces of Ukraine pushed back the Russians from the grey zone west of Krasnohorivka and regained the positions they had previously abandoned. So you can see the railway line coming up here, the retaking of some area there for the Ukrainians. I don't know what's happened to my browser. So this is the area to the west of Krasnohorivka, this particular area there. Not the railway line that comes up there where the Russians have fought to and have crossed it according to Surya Maps slightly to the north. This is more towards Terrakom, the slag heap down to the south of Krasnohorivka. The Russians have apparently been pushed back in that area. Max 23 here saying in the Avdiivka direction, the Russians are in some degree of trouble. There's lots of destroyed equipment that appears to be from the last 24 hours. Lots of, as I say, blown up equipment, stuff on fire, and that is more recent than what we have seen before. So it is again an example of some pretty costly attempts at advancing, particularly in the north. Deep State Map has released some details about today's Russian attempted attack on Avdiivka. So today, this was from this morning. So quote, the enemy resumed assault operations from the direction of Krasnohorivka. Once again, a column of a significant number of equipment pushed towards the railway track with the aim of gaining a foothold on the further exit to Stepova. However, the work of the artillerymen of the 31st, 110th and Presidential Brigades of Ukraine did not allow another armoured fist of the enemy to succeed. As we've already noted before, it's not yet time to say that the enemy's offensive actions in the Avdiivka area have ended, because it is not known how many more reserves they have to go on an assault. And today's assault is an example of the fact that the active phase continues. The shock fist of a large number of equipment and personnel is still available. We are monitoring the situation. It's just, I mean, goodness me, it's like I sound like a stuck record saying the same thing day after day. With 10 days now, we've had the Russians throwing in equipment and personnel, and the Ukrainian General Staff figures for Russian losses on a daily basis are just massive numbers of troops and APVs and tanks. And you're thinking, can this really be true? And then day after day, the footage is coming out to suggest, indeed, this is true. And it's definition of insanity, doing the same thing day after day and expecting different results. So let's see what Emil, I know we've done a few of these analyses, but we'll do another one, this one from Emil Kasterhelmi. Again, I've dipped into a number of his analyses previously. Even though the intensity of the offensive has decreased, so the Russians have been attacking in Avdiivka direction for a week there. Even though it's decreased in intensity, Russia has suffered large equipment losses and has made very limited progress. Ukraine is still in a potentially dangerous situation, though. The general situation in Avdiivka is clear. Russians attempt to encircle the city from two sides. In order to do this, the Russians would have to advance through multiple fields and villages after a week of fighting. Ukraine still has a 7 to 8 kilometer gap between the Russian pincers. As the front lines have been largely static for almost a year now, the Ukrainians have had time to prepare. The terrain mostly favours the defender, and there aren't many surprising directions of advance. The Russians likely noticed this too during the last week. And next, we will take a closer look on the Russian efforts on both sides of the city. In short, the Russians didn't achieve much in terms of captured square kilometers. However, they did lose much in terms of manpower and vehicles. In the northern sector, initially some Russian units managed to reach the railroad and the waste heap on the northern side of Avdiivka. Ukraine inflicted major losses on the advancing units. It seems Russians have failed in establishing a lasting foothold in either of these points. So if you're going to look at doing this pincer, where you're coming in from the north and trying to get up from the south as well to close this ground line of communication at, say, Lastot, Kerner, then that would mean Avdiivka is broadly operationally encircled. That's what they were trying to do. They got to the railway line and then were beaten back and then tried again. They've suffered huge casualties in this area. They failed to take the slag heap, even though they claimed to have done so. They have had slightly more success to the south, but again at quite some cost. So just to continue in the southern sector, so as you can see there, they've tried here a number of times. They just lost huge significant Russian casualties in the fields around Krasnohorivka. Okay, so then the next one is this southern push. Russia's tried to attack from Vodyane towards Severny and Tonyenka. There was some minor progress at some tree lines, but mostly the attacks were repelled. There was no indication of Ukraine losing any villages or significant positions in this area. Avdiivka bears very limited strategical meaning. If the Russians capture it, they won't have any good options for continuing the offensive. I think it's more about the defensive qualities of Avdiivka. So Avdiivka is, I would say, it does have strategic value for the Russians, but in terms of pushing the Ukrainian artillery back here so they're less able to hammer Donetsk. Donetsk gets repeatedly hit and military targets are often picked off within Donetsk. They just need to push a buffer zone around Donetsk, with it being quite a major city. The area behind Avdiivka doesn't directly enable further operations. Capturing Avdiivka would only straighten a front line, although I think that is important for the Russians, right? So Russian goals seem to be more of a political nature. I'd say maybe, but I think it also is a place that they would like to take, but for all the reasons I've already given. They have not had any victories in months. Capturing Bakhmut was hardly one. The Avdiivka salient could provide, in theory, possibilities for faster success. However, Russians have not yet been able to exploit this. Even though the first attacks were repelled, Russia will likely go again in this direction in the future. There aren't many similar targets elsewhere. Progress will probably be slow, naturally depending on how many resources Russia will direct into capturing Avdiivka. In Bakhmut, Russians eventually switched from active flanking efforts into capturing the city block by block. If the Russians are fixated on capturing Avdiivka, there can be a long and difficult battle ahead, as Ukrainians are likely just as determined to hold it. In the long run, Ukraine may need to solve the encirclement threat with a counterattack, especially in the northern direction, where it can develop into a real issue. Russians don't need to advance far in order to make the situation more complicated for the AFU. The distances are short. I mean, this is correct. So, as mentioned earlier, sort of 7 to 8 kilometer distance or gap here between. There you go. So that's 8 kilometers between the two Russian pincers, as according to Syriac maps. It might be more than that, depending on which mapper you are referring to. So if it's, say, Andrew Perpetua, those defensive lines are 10 kilometers apart. So yeah, it's not hugely far. All you would need is for the Russians to get to that railway line, take the slag heap or around it, move up to Severny, and really you've got 3 kilometers to this road, so that you can put it under fire control with ATGMs, and the defense of Avdiivka suddenly becomes somewhat more difficult. It really is. This neck is much more closed than Bakhmut. So if you look at Bakhmut, I mean, obviously Bakhmut's taken now, but it wasn't. They tried to go around the sides, but they couldn't quite succeed. And so actually, half of the city was open, and these supply roads, right until obviously it was lost. They had to go through the city, though. Is a point to take it. Whereas Bakhmut is somewhat different in that they really are looking to enclose it, and then this whole city would be operationally encircled, and they lose it not by going through it, but by successfully encircling it. Now, they might try and go through it here, but as mentioned, it could be really difficult. So I would assume it's the Ukrainians will be thinking long and hard about which of these salients is the weakest. There was talk previously about up around Nova Bakhmutivka. Andrew Perpetua saying actually this is ripe for the picking, and they could do a counterattack around here. That could undermine this northern pincer if you were to fight into this direction. But of course, the Ukrainians have also got to consider what their moves are elsewhere in terms of the larger counteroffensive. So would that be the best use of their troops? How much do Ukraine want to keep hold of Avdiivka? Would that be for political reasons or for operational strategic reasons? Anyway, as the source says, there are some worrying features, even though Ukraine managed to repel Russians for now. Russia proved two things. It tried to take the initiative in a relatively fresh direction. Secondly, it still has reserves to do it, even though many have claimed the opposite. Even though it seems Russians have learned some lessons from previous offensives, for example from Vuhledar, the tactical outcome of the offensive in Avdiivka was still a failure. This, however, indicates that Russia aims to actively learn and adapt. But if it doesn't seem to have adapted so far here. 10 days, and today they're still doing the same thing, which is in plain sight, trying to mount combined arms maneuvers with a bunch of equipment and then get picked off. And they don't have counter battery fire. The claims are still surfacing about how terrible it is, particularly in Avdiivka. So many claims about Avdiivka from Russian sources. Anyway, as we come out of there, to be honest, I haven't looked at the ISW that was kind of talking about some of those claims. So Russian sources are increasingly complaining about the poor conditions facing Russian forces fighting near Avdiivka. One Russian correspondent who's purportedly fighting near there and who notably presented an optimistic view of the situation on the first days of the Russian assault claimed that the situation is now unchanged and remarked that the poor performance of Russian counter-battery fire is the, quote, number one problem across the board in this area. Another Russian Telegram user amplified screenshots and messages sent by Russian soldier near Avdiivka in which the soldier complains about foul sanitary conditions within Russian trenches and reports that Ukrainian artillery and helicopter fire are preventing Russian forces from moving out of their trenches. On the other hand, the spokesperson for the Ukrainians has reported that Russian forces are regrouping near Avdiivka and have not given up efforts to surround the city. And the head of the city, the Ukrainian head, Barabash, noted that Russian forces appeared to be regrouping as well near Avdiivka and warned that there will likely be a new stage of fighting in the coming days. The question is, will the Russians actually adapt and change any of their tactics for trying to take Avdiivka, or will it be more of the same and just hope to win in some kind of Pyrrhic victory? But it doesn't look like that would be the method that would give them the most success. And then we come down to Novomykhailivka, north of there, where there seems to be a sort of pincer attempt at taking Novomykhailivka, which could help them with Pobieda and have knock-on effects with to Marinka. But yeah, so there are some gains according to Suryat Maps, who says that the situation there are positional battles continuing around Novomykhailivka that continue with high intensity, while the Russian army is making small advances northeast of the town. And yeah, if that's to be trusted, then it might be slightly worrying because they are making some gains either side of the town. Right, then we come on down to Vuhledar and across to the Velika Novosilka salient, where there isn't an awful lot. In fact, not really an awful lot to talk about along the whole of the southern front line. Yet there are sort of attacks in these areas. Ukrainian General Staff reporting that Ukrainian forces achieved unspecified partial success. So that's all the way to south of Robotyne. You can see they've put both of these areas all in the same group of paragraphs, which is an indication that actually there's not a huge amount of news coming out of both these places. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian infantry groups conducted a large-scale attack on Verbove and Novoprokopivka with 4 or 5 units of equipment and groups of 20 people each. A Russian news aggregator claimed that Ukrainian forces attacked near Kopani as well. So yeah, there is activity in the Velika Novosilka salient, activity in the Robotyne salient, but no changes to the mapping as according to the mapping sources that I use. Yeah, is that a bit of a stalemate? Are the Ukrainians going to be able to make significant further gains? My opinion would be that if you can get JDAMs into Novoprokopivka, if you can absolutely hammer the heck out of this town, then that's how you make advances. Just take a leaf out of the Russian book in that respect. Although I would use the artillery somewhat more sparingly, but JDAMs would be super useful if they can use them there. It depends on how susceptible they are to electronic warfare and whatnot. Right, okay, as we move to the west, we're going to come down to Kherson, which is actually where most people's attention has been for the last few days. And this is because, just making sure there isn't anything I have missed. No, okay. So this is because Rebar initially came out with some pretty panicky claims about Ukrainian attacks across the river near the Antonivsky Bridge, which is fairly close to Kherson, or very close to Kherson. If what they say has happened, then this is good news for the Ukrainians. These are all Ukrainian games. I see why there's some color issues. Hang on. Right, solved, and that would have solved all the other miscoloured pins that I had elsewhere, so silly me, sorry about that. Right, so as you can see in this Kherson area, both mappers, Andrew Perpetua and indeed Suriyat Maps, show some fairly considerable gains for the Ukrainians here, stretching quite a number of, well, let's see, that's about, that's 7 kilometers wide area where the Ukrainians have made some inroads across these islands and pushed the Russians back. Now, if they're going to be planning on, as there are some rumours or some speculation that they could then try and get a bridgehead again at Kozachi Lahiri, I mean, you could have a good, I guess, 10 kilometres worth of riverbank, where if you include what they've already got up here, then really that is, you could imagine they could have, that's 50 kilometers there worth of purchase on, or depends what you call by the other side of the river, because these islands are part of the left bank of the Dnipro, but actually then you've got these other smaller tributaries like the Konka River that you have to get over as well before you get to, in a sense, the other side. So the Russians are able to defend over here. Depends what you call the left bank of the river, whether the left bank of the river is here or whether really it's much more seriously over here. So anyway, situation there is looking good for the Ukrainians. The question is, how many troops, what type of equipment they've got across there, so on and so forth. And Andrew Perpetua yesterday was saying, look, don't jump the gun until there's decent evidence. So Suriyat Map says, situation in Kherson front during the last 24 hours, Ukrainian armies managed to cross the Dnipro River on the southern shore from where they have eventually reached the outskirts of the villages of Poima and Pischanivka. So this is agreeing with what Rebar said yesterday. Today, the Russian army managed to drive back the Ukrainian forces towards the northern part of the railway bridge where they are present now. The Ukrainian actions, although not intended to establish a foothold in the localities, have demonstrated the possibility of carrying out a large-scale landing operation in which Russian troops could face difficulties. And I guess that's actually probably a good understanding at the end. It's that probing sort of attack. Say, well, can we get a foothold here? What do we think? How have the Russian defending soldiers forced us to, think twice about this, or is this somewhat easier than we thought? And can we capitalize on that? So I guess we'll see over the next few days. No Reports says elements of the Ukrainian Marines started operating on the left bank near Poima, Pischanivka. Ukrainian forces were located on the approaches as well as the outskirts of Pischanivka, Poima. If this is an operation for a permanent foothold, well, it's now unknown, or it's as of yet unknown. At first, they were located near the railway bridge, and I showed you this yesterday. So there's a railway bridge on, I'll get it on my map. This all happened near the this railway bridge that goes across the Dnipro there, and then crosses the Konka River here. That's been destroyed, that bridge, but that was where there was evidence of Russian bombing that showed that the Ukrainians were indeed there. So here we have the Ukrainians near that destroyed railway bridge on the southern shore there. And Ukrainian forces being targeted on the left bank of the Kherson River or the Dnipro River near the railway bridge over the Verkhnaya Konka River south of Pridniprovska, confirming presence in this area. So that is, that's what's happened there, or at least, evidence of activity by the Ukrainians there. More footage from FAB bombs being dropped. So these are the guided glide bombs being dropped on Ukrainian positions on the exact same area. I do believe the Ukrainian raid groups or deep reconnaissance groups are active there, but an advanced deployment is out of the question. Seems like Russians have once again set the stages for a heroically repelled attack, scare quotes. The idea there is that the Russians, like Rebar, if you overclaim on Ukrainian advances, then when the Ukrainians aren't actually there, you claim a repelled counterattack, pushing Ukrainians back, and it makes you look much better than you initially were. So it's you oversell the Ukrainian advances, and then you're able to oversell the Russian advances, and the proximity bias means the last thing you heard is what you're kind of biased by, and you think, wow, the Russians have done really well. And of course, it's all kind of manufactured. That would be that theory. I'm not saying that that's what's happened, but that's what No Reports is kind of hinting at. Max 23 Marines of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, according to the ISW, landed on the left bank of the Kherson region. ISW wrote the 2 assault groups there. If you landed, so it's the 35th and 36th Naval Assault Brigades. The Marines landed on the eastern bank of the Dnipro and broke through the defences, liberated Poima village and the northern outskirts of Pishchanivka, which I don't think has happened, but I'm not sure. I mean, Poima isn't the biggest of settlements. It's quite hard to work out exactly what Poima is. I think it's these buildings and a railway station, really. So it's not exactly an awful lot else, and it's none of this stuff. It's just a few dotted bit of that'll be railway facilities or some kind of storage facilities in order to get it on the railway, so on and so forth. There's really very few villages, so it's a sort of place that a small group of soldiers probably could take quite easily. So maybe it's not outside the realms of plausibility. Pishchanivka would be much more difficult given the size of that place. It could well be that they did get as far as Poima and take some of those houses, but I don't know. I guess we'll see. There is some footage coming out. So Kherson left bank, a Russian propagandist filmed the road from Oleshki to Radensk yesterday. Russians have suffered on the map, the road, and the approximate Ukrainian positions in the area. It was unexpected for the Russians, confirmed by Ukrainian and Russian sources. So there is evidence that there is destroyed equipment. He's only gone and done it. Hey, so the point is there is evidence of destroyed equipment, but the question is, has that been done by troops in the area, deep reconnaissance group, or much more likely that's been done by first-person view drones and whatnot. Anyway, that's the end of the mapping update today. I think that's all my sources. Yeah, all the sources on that area. So this is one to keep an eye out, eye open, concerning, because it's it could develop into something useful, or it might just be overegged by the Russians so they can claim a decent counterattack. There seems to be stasis on this Zaporizhia front line. The Russians are potentially committing military suicide in Donetsk, and the Ukrainians are having grinding success to the south of Bakhmut particularly, and there is potential for Russian attack in the north. That's kind of your TLDR. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Appreciate all your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.